So maybe I'll get a ton of red cards. I'm prepared for that. Feel free to slow me down or ask me to clarify things. But I think everyone in the room will take what they want out of it. So I wanted to give a little sense. Are those slides up now? Okay. So when Jen and I talked about this incredible vision that she had on the early days, I thought, okay, well, I just wrote an article about community. Because I was sort of tired of how vague everybody is when they talk about community and inclusion. Community, that term, that concept, does a lot of heavy lifting. You know, people say, we'll just include people in community. We'll just integrate people in community. We'll have community within our schools, right? You've all heard that term. Almost no one ever defines what they mean, and they never define how they're actually going to get there, from the idea to the actual inclusion of people. And so when I wrote this article that I'm going to talk to you a bit about today, I was thinking, I think we need to be a bit more honest about what community is. And as Jen mentioned, I'm a professor of disability studies, which is an interdisciplinary field. That means that you've got psychology, anthropology, history, everything mixed in there. And in that field, we work with and study people with, we call it pan-impairment, so all kinds of different impairment conditions, from blindness and deafness, well, although some deaf people would say that's a cultural difference, but right through to learning disabilities and intellectual disability. But, so I am a disability studies person, but what I wanted to talk about, I think I have a slide for this, hold on. What I want to talk about is what it is and then the limits of it, because the field is limited in a certain way. And one of the ways that I think it's limited the most is that it doesn't deal with intellectual disability very well. So I'm going to break lots of rules today, because sometimes in disability studies there's a notion you should only talk about disability as a whole, as a sort of political strategy. But I think that intellectual disability deserves special attention. So let me navigate here between these two things. So what counts as community? So I'm going to define a disability studies field just briefly, so you know where I'm coming from. I'm actually a cultural anthropologist by training, meaning I studied L'Arche as the natives, as my friend Warren used to say. Then I'm going to try to define community. Okay, so I've looked at lots of different ways that people talked about it, and summarized a few things for you that I think make sense for what people in this room are doing. Then I'm going to get to the heart of it, which is I'm going to tell you 4 fake stories or false stories that I think people tell about community, which are really dangerous, in particular for people with intellectual disability. After that, I'll give you some examples of who I think does community better. Of course, L'Arche will be one of them. And then I'm going to talk about, well, how do I teach this to students? Because they're not all going to come live in a L'Arche community necessarily. So I'll talk a little bit about how can we think of this differently? How can we be a bit more honest about what we mean when we talk about community and inclusion? And Jen, let me just do a time check too. Should I aim for like 45 minutes with 15, 20 for questions?
Sure. We have a break at 10:30, Pamela, so the time is yours.
Okay, great. I have so much I'd love to share. And please do, I love being interrupted. I already gave Marianne, where's Marianne from Daybreak? I already gave Marianne encouragement and permission to interrupt me, because when she and Warren Pott do guest lectures for my classes at King's, Marianne, you keep Warren on point, don't you?
I'm here.
Oh, you're here, okay.
Will you share your slides
Sure.
with us?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. Do you mean like right now, or?
No.
I'm here. You're here, yes. Okay, so you can stay here, or you can sit, or whatever. All I mean is, anytime you want to raise a card, or have an issue with what I'm saying, you can let it out. Is there something you have to say right now?
I'm very happy to see you tonight. So I've been in the fight for you, oh gosh, and Lucy. I'm very happy to get to see you tonight. So I'm very happy to see you. I've been a good friend now.
Happy
To see you. So tonight, good fun.
Okay.
Good fun. You need. Good for me, good for you.
Okay, so you'll interrupt if you have any questions?
Question?
No, you.
Okay.
After, let me talk a little bit,
again.
Okay. I fear you have set up very high expectations of fun for my talk, so do you want to sit down? Yeah. Okay, cool. All right, and then, yeah, like I said, I'll get into, thanks, Marianne, push-pull strategies and visual activism as ways around this. So as Toinette said, yeah, I'm happy to share those slides later. Okay, so now I'll talk a bit more formally. So in disability studies, I'm really lucky because I'm teaching students who are sort of 17 to 22 most of the time. And one of the things that's great about teaching them self-disability is that they often know a lot more than I do about certain things. And that's because they've had the benefit of going through the inclusive school system. And I say inclusive in quotes, obviously we all know it's a work in progress. But they have had all kinds of experiences of attempts at inclusion. I see someone sitting in the room here who lives with one of my students, right? And so they're often sharing back their experiences of what worked and what didn't work in camps and schools and in their workplaces. But disability studies as a field brings something to the students too. So I'll just describe what it is. It started off, really it was a field, like a field of study that started off with people with disabilities. So as a kind of a resistance. So what were they resisting? In large part they were resisting a sort of dominant narrative. So narrative, just another word for story. So they're resisting this dominant narrative that society put on them, which is this, that they're a problem, that disability is only a problem, that it's a problem that needs to be fixed, as opposed to just part of human diversity, and that everything about them really has to do with medicine or therapy, right? So because we call it this sort of professionalization or medicalization of disability and impairment. So people with disabilities themselves were saying, that's not all who I am. You know, yeah, I have an impairment, there's something different about how my mind or my body works, but it's not even maybe the most important thing about me. You know, it might also be, you know, a daughter or a painter, a sculptor. I might be an athlete for Special Olympics, right? So they were trying to say, why is all of that not recognized about me? Why does everyone only want to talk about my intellectual disability? So that was one thing they were resisting. What did they want? They wanted agency, which means I want to be able to do things on my own, like maybe with some support, but act independently. They wanted to be seen as subjects, which just means as whole people. So not as a medical diagnosis or a label, right, but as whole people. They wanted to have access. They wanted it recognized that part of the reason people with intellectual disabilities weren't able to learn in our society is not because they're not capable, it's because the schools and the pedagogies and curriculums were not yet adapted, right? So instead of saying, as you probably know, 100 years ago, there were actually official labels called ineducable, an idiot, and these kind of terms. And all the blame was put on the person with disability. Were you putting your hand up? No. You're just stretching, okay. So the blame was put on them. You can't learn because you have an impairment. And instead, these self-advocates pushed back and they said, I can't learn because you are not teaching me in a very good way, right? And you can see in our school systems that this is really changing a lot. This idea, like not, you know, if you, what's that saying? They always show a fish. You know, if you think the only way for a fish to learn is to climb a tree like a monkey does, well, the fish is obviously never going to do very well, right? So we need different kinds of schooling. They also wanted voice and choice. So a big saying in disability studies is nothing about us without us. In other words, stop making decisions about us with us not in the room. And that might seem so deadly obvious, but it still absolutely happens today. Okay, so I was just an examiner on a PhD thesis of a wonderful woman. She'd been a teacher in the London School Board for 30 years and working in special education. Does anybody know what an IEP is, an independent education plan? Does anybody not know what it is? No? Okay, so it's like whatever your learning disability, your intellectual disability, you get this sort of special plan. What supports is the school going to give you? Can you hear me okay back there? Yeah? Okay. And this woman, she'd specialized in that all her career. And I thought it was brilliant that instead of doing a PhD at the beginning of the career, which is what most of us do, she had a career and then sort of culminated all her learning in a PhD. It was amazing. But it was very sad because she did it about IEPs, and she had the trust of all the teachers because she works with them, she is one. And she interviewed them all and said, tell me what you think about this system we have of IEPs. You know, does it work? Does it work? Do you know what you're doing? And the statistics were, you wouldn't believe, but like over 90% of the teachers said, I do not know appropriately how to create one, right? They might know for one thing like ADHD, but they don't know for the 80 other LDs. You know, I don't know how to create one. Also, it's a royal pain in the butt to create one, okay? So if I'm the grade 3 teacher and I get one from the grade 2 teacher, the amount of work it would take to change it, even if I know that the grade 2 teacher's assessment was not accurate, it is so much work to bring all the principals and specialists and parents together. I usually don't bother. You know, I'll do it a little differently in my class, but I don't actually change the IEP. So sometimes, this is what she found, these IEPs were inaccurate IEPs were following kids throughout their school system. Right? And this is not to blame teachers. You know, she was a teacher, so she was saying, but they don't get enough education in the BEd. They're not required to take the additional vocational qualifications that would help them to learn to do it better, and they're not paid for the time to do that. So it's one of those situations, you know, you get what you pay for. One of the other findings she had, which is one of the saddest, is that in 85% of the meetings, can anybody guess who is not in the meeting? That's right, exactly. So this idea of having voice and choice, like you're not even in the room, never mind vote, you're not even present, right? So this seems obvious, but the disability movement and disability studies field has been fighting for it since the 60s, still not happening. The social model is kind of a core idea in the disability studies field, so I'll just explain it. I actually like to, they call it social model, but I think that's confusing because it makes it sound like if you're friendly, you're disability positive. So I call it the societal model. So what it basically says is instead of the medical model, which is what I described before, where you know, you're just seen as your medical label and how you can be fixed, a societal model takes the lens off, the camera lens off the person with disability, and turns it on society, on your classrooms, on your workplaces, on malls and movie theaters and sports programming, right? And it says, how do we change all of those things? That's where the problem is, right? That those things need to be changed, not just fixing the person. So in disability studies, sometimes we say it's about environment changing, not person fixing. Okay? So all of those are really good things. And elsewhere I've talked and written about how weirdly closely Jean Vanier's ideas and L'Arche's practices map onto some of the main principles of disability studies, even though Jean and some of you in the room started this in the 60s, even sort of when DS was just incepted. You know, disability studies didn't really take off until the 80s. So it's neat that there's so much overlap. But what I want to talk about today with disability studies is its limit. And as I mentioned before, they're trying to have these goals, but in order to meet them all, sometimes they have to, or they think they have to, mute the diversity. Does anybody know what percentage of people roughly identify in Canada as having a disability of any sort? Just a guess?
60%.
Very close, 16, yeah, it's about 14, and there's lots of different studies. So yeah, around 14 to 15% of people identify as having an impairment. So in Canada, it's the largest single minority group that we have. But unlike certain other minority groups, say French speakers, there's a massive amount of diversity within that group. Well, not to say French people aren't diverse, sorry. But you know what I mean? There's a huge difference between, say, someone identifying with the label of Down syndrome versus a minor learning disability. So as a whole, the field has had trouble with that. And unfortunately, intellectual disability is probably the condition that's fallen off their map the most. And in order to create a kind of, in order to create a kind of political critical mass, they've sort of said, well, we all want these things. So some of those things they say is like, we all want independence and we all want full paid employment. So you see things like where the Ontario government canceled all the sheltered workshops, which maybe some people will be annoyed if I say this, but I thought that was such a odd process that they went through. So they canceled them all, said, we're gonna get rid of these, they're not adequate, they're not paid at full employment. But now we're left with all kinds of people with no meaningful daytime activities at all, right? So there's sometimes this move towards an ideological ideal, like that's what we want, full paid employment, full integration and mainstreaming, without the steps to get there. Was someone asking a question? Just shouting, okay. Without the steps to get there, to actually create something different. So you're leaving people in the wilderness a little bit. So that's what I want to talk about a bit today, is why does that happen? And how do they get away with it? How do they get away with leaving out a whole group of people? People who identify as having intellectual disabilities somewhere between 2.5% to 3% in that 14%. Okay, so there have been all kinds of amazing changes in the field in the last 50, 60 years, especially since deinstitutionalization. However, many aspects of community inclusion, there are many aspects of community inclusion that we haven't figured out very good practices yet for. And we're not yet very good at distinguishing between the physical or technical aspects of caring for people, right, versus the social or attitudinal angle of caring about people, right? So I think we're much better at the caring for people than we are at the caring about. I don't mean people in this room, but at getting the general public to care about them. And at the end of the talk, I'll come back to some ideas on how to do that. So in this talk today, I'm going to argue that one of the ways to encourage greater inclusion for this really diverse group of people that represents people having intellectual disability is to encourage and sustain greater plurality of provision options. So in other words, to have more options, not less. And while that might seem self-evident, because if we looked around this room and asked people how many people like sports, how many people like art, how many people like reading, how many people like nature, right? Most of us want a lot of different options. You know, this week I feel like doing this, next year I feel like doing that. But even though that seems self-evident, there are quite a large subset of theorists or thinkers in disability studies field in particular, who seem to want to do the opposite. They want to, they argue at least for a sort of narrow homogenizing. Homogenizing means, you know, being the same version of inclusion to prevail. So they think that they know what the right way to do inclusion is, and they want that. They want to put all the resources into doing that. And what I find most interesting about this is that they make this claim, sometimes very adamantly, sometimes with very harsh criticisms of places like L'Arche or Special Olympics, with very little actual evidence. So I am a researcher at the end of the day, so we're not really in the business of opinions, right? Lots of people can have opinions and they're good and interesting and very fun. But when it comes to research, we like to say, well, how do you know that? Why do you think that mainstreaming all the kids into the same classroom would be better? Why? There might be ideas you have about it, like, hey, everyone should be normal. Everyone should have a chance at a normal classroom setting. But did you actually try it? Because there's a big gap between a good idea and a good practice, right? A good actual way of doing it. So I think what's dangerous is not just that they hold up a particular idea of inclusion, but they can be very negative in criticizing those who do it in a different way. So I sometimes like to say this switches from a promised opportunity for inclusion in community to a rigid obligation to be included in a particular way. And I know that I wouldn't want that. I wouldn't want someone to tell me, Pam, you don't work out enough. You need to go to the gym more. Here's the gym you're going to go to. Here's the hours you're going to go there, right? How many people would want that? Nobody, right? Okay. So, one reason that I think that our field has gotten stuck in that ideological bias is that we've lacked a clear definition of what we mean by community. So I think if we had a clear definition of what community actually is and what it does, and especially what do people with intellectual disability think is important to them in community? You know, how do they define it? Actually asking them. And not expecting one answer, of course, right? This is a very diverse group of people. But I think that if we had a better sense of that definition, which I think is part of what Jen's idea was, what are we talking about when we talk about community? We could get better at doing research that would actually show whether we're achieving those things or not. Okay, so I'm going to get you into a couple of definitions here. So, because this is not an academic talk, I'm not going to cite things, but if anybody wants, I'm happy to give you the academic paper that has all the citations and references in it. But I really like this simple definition. I sort of culled together a bunch of different definitions and thought this is a nice way to put it. The community is a feeling of belonging. You don't have a question?
No.
Okay. The community is a feeling of belonging towards a group that has something in common. So that what you have in common could be a lot of different things: traits, interests, attitudes, values, goals, or a place. You know, so vegetarians could be a community, skateboarders could be a community, nudists could be a community. I saw a couple of nudist colony signs driving in here from Quebec. Didn't have time to stop, unfortunately. And some of the things, what do they share in common? So they tend to have shared values. Okay, that's why they want to spend time together, right? They often want to have a similar lifestyle. These are your notes? You're told to go downstairs.
I happened I forgot about my note this morning. What happened in the morning? I sleep too long. I was tired, nightmare. What happened this morning? I happened in the morning, night. I happened to make mistakes. I made talk too much. He made up story. Cause I started to make a joke. And the mayor says, I heard it, walk away, and not talk myself. I go home tomorrow. And then thank you.
Do you want me to read these? Tom? Did you want me to read these at the end or now or at the end?
Yes, and
Okay,
twisted.
at the end.
To the right.
Where is Tom? Okay, thank you. One of the big words says downstairs. I didn't know, Tom, if you're telling me to go downstairs. Adding to your bad morning. Okay, I lost my screen. So I wanted to, the shared values, lifestyle, and economic interdependence. I wonder if you could take a minute. I've got another slide about a little bit further definitions, but could you take 1 minute just to talk to people at your table about what makes you feel a sense of community and belonging? You could write some of those down on the cue card, maybe. Just 1 minute. Thank you, Marianne. I'm going to keep going on the slide. Do you want to come up here? Okay, I'm going to keep going. All right, some of the other things people talk about is how communities need to have longevity, right? People stay there. How many years have you been at large?
That's good.
You've been 10 years?
Yep, 20 years.
Yeah,
Okay.
8 to 10 years. Marianne comes and lectures in the classes at King sometimes,
Right.
or by Zoom. Okay, I'm going to keep going. Physical proximity, meaning we live together, right? We don't have to. There's a lot of interesting evolution of the community literature right now by virtual communities, but something that you brought up at the back of the room about commitment, that's often a question. If you don't have physical proximity, how committed are you to that other person's well-being, you know, when something happens? And then 2 aspects of community, very nice, lavender nail polish. Did someone in community do that with you?
Yeah, I did.
I did myself. So.
I should put that as another bullet point. Nail painting.
Yeah, right.
Okay. Mutual.
Hey, laughing.
It was a good laugh. It was a positive laugh. Mutual responsibility and productivity are two aspects that are also in the community literature often, but they have interesting negative balances or tricky balances when it comes to intellectual disability, because often there's quite a narrow sense of what it means to be mutually responsible. You know, who's giving what kind of care, what counts as care, what counts as productivity. So those are areas that are in common definitions of community that can be exclusional here as well. So here's where I want us to get honest, Marianne, is when it comes to what does all this mean? What does all this mean in terms of intellectual disability? So I'd say that we have to acknowledge that community can both include and exclude. So there are all kinds of communities, sub-communities within the larger city, let's say. For example, a YMCA, for example, a grade 5 classroom, right? And those communities try to build up a sense of cohesion and mutual responsibility, and what are we doing together? What is the shared values we have? But in so doing, it can be very difficult for them to be wide enough and robust enough to include all of the people in that group. Difference is also hard. I mentioned that I'm an anthropologist, and anthropologists, on the one hand, anthropology is a study of different cultures, and it's about how do we try to get along better? How do we understand the other, the ethnic other in that case, so that we can get along? But anthropologists, at least the good ones I think, have also recognized and acknowledged that difference is really hard, right? The more common thing, integration of difference is not that common. We don't willingly go towards that. Homophilia is a term we use, which means being attracted to things that are the same as you, or people that are the same as you, have the same interests. What am I talking?
You good voice, so.
Good voice, thank you. Thank you, Marianne. So, homophilics, yeah. You now, because you like me, we're homophiliating together.
Now you're laughing. Who's laughing? Who's laughing?
It was a happy laugh. Happy laugh. So,
good you talking.
thank you.
Thanks.
To understand why it's been hard to recreate a sense of community and inclusion for people with developmental disability, it's instructive to review research on showing that incorporating difference into community is always hard. Most people want to belong to communities with others who are like them. Studies on how new communities form show that while lip service is often paid to diversity, community unity is often only achieved through repressing diversity. Right? So we gotta bring everyone in line in order to create that unity. So there's kind of this, what we say and what we actually do, and to some extent what we have to do. L'Arche, as you all have heard the origin story a million times about 3 people were invited, 1 had to leave, 2 were left. You know, there was already in that initial founding this question of how much diversity can we hold on to, right? And it's not necessarily a bad thing, as long as there are other communities someone can belong to. There are 2 really good studies that were done on this topic, one with undergraduates and one with gay actors, LGBT actors in an experimental political theater group. And both of them show that even in these sort of idealistic communities that are, both show that even the unity that they feel upon first coming together is often short-lived once even minor aspects of diversity surface and disrupt the sort of comfort of sameness. Someone was saying before, comfort. The resistance to difference is not surprising. Ethnocentrism is what anthropologists call our preference for the familiar, right? We always think the way we do things is sort of the best and normal, quote unquote, even though we can look around the world and see there are many other ways of doing things. But that is a sort of universal human default setting. It provides useful protection and identity functions, right? if you don't know who you are, you have no sense of identity, you don't know where you belong in the world, you lose your mooring. Other people's differences challenge our worldview and sometimes leave us feeling uncertain and uncomfortable around them. And this is heightened if the difference is also coded as a form of inferiority, which often happens, unfortunately, with disability. Rabbi Sachs, who's an English rabbi, he says the problem of the stranger, quote unquote, of the getting along with the stranger, is our most vexing moral and spiritual issue of the 21st century. It is not obvious how to appreciate the gift of difference, and even less so of societally devalued differences, and to find a way to welcome it. And yet, most of the literature, and even us in regular everyday life, we romanticize the unifying potential of community to welcome difference. It's a hopeful fiction of community, and it often portrays integration of difference as unquestionably good for everyone, right? They'll be just like, yeah, let's welcome all the diversity, it's going to be wonderful. When in our heads we're thinking, I'm not actually sure about that. And the fact that even while we now have laws and rights about integrating and non-discrimination, we still have very strong examples of social exclusion for people with developmental disability. It suggests that the public is not yet convinced of the value of integration. This is perhaps not surprising given how rarely integration initiatives acknowledge the public's ambivalent motivation or incentive to stick with the challenges. We don't usually talk to people about what are the stakes in it for them, right? The more people you include, the more space there is for you. So when you've got people who are already on the inside, you have to think about what are you asking them to give up when they're going to share power and share space in their community. We rarely address the underlying fears, and without getting into a Trump screed here today, I was just saying we're seeing the kind of exact evidence of this, what I talk about in relation to disability, in the United States with, we had the civil rights movement, there was this hopeful talk and not just rhetoric, talk and some action about how do we put people of different ethnicities together in schools and in workplaces and move past all that discrimination, right? And there were laws that were passed and there was funding supporting it and programs. But it would appear now, as you see this sort of mounting white supremacy narrative and actions in the US, that what wasn't dealt with was that underlying fear of the other, of difference, of all immigrants. It's just the same thing that I try to talk about in disability, of if we just put programs in place and change the buildings people are in, that doesn't necessarily make the public all of a sudden think, oh, okay, now I want to welcome them, now I want to hire them into my business and welcome them into my classroom. You'll have to actually really have those hard conversations with people. And what I'd argue is that we haven't necessarily done that as a field. And it's not a terrible thing. We've started through doing the legislation and the policy changes, but now we will come to some more difficult conversations. The contact hypothesis is a set of studies that was done in the United States through the 60s and 70s around the civil rights ideas. So there was a whole team of researchers looking at, is this actually true? If you desegregate schools and put people of different ethnicities together, will they stop hating each other? And most of the research came out and said, no, not if you just put them together, right? And they came up with a list of about 8 or 9 factors that you have to do to make a difference. And again, ironically, L'Arche does a number of those. But they said you can't just put people together. So in the same way, we can't just push people into community. We have to invite people into conversations about why it would be wonderful to have them in community. Okay, so as I said before, I'm going to talk about sort of a focus here is to talk about how do we get to this place of why don't we talk more honestly about community? And when we do talk about what are the false stories that we tell? And I think that these stories prevent genuine belonging, genuine inclusion programming, because they make us think we're further along than we are. Okay, so these are the 4. First myth is society is a welcoming place for people with disabilities. Number 2, only non-disabled friends count. Number 3, specialization is all bad, or segregation. And number 4, being alone and free is better than living in community but having to make some compromises. So I'm going to go through each of these. And I think, and then at the end I'll show sort of like a general criticism of them. Okay, so the first myth I'd say is this idea that society is a welcoming community for disabled people. DP I use as a short form for disabled people. PWDD would be developmentally disabled. And we talk about this all the time in our policies and our programming, right? It's like, we're going to create, for example, at King's, we worked with one really great local organization, and they wanted to do a drumming circle. And they say, we're gonna do it on your university campus where there's all these young people, and drumming is cool, and we're gonna have an integrated experience, right? And they come out every Wednesday, and I do my best to put advertising up and posters, and we give them one of the most beautiful spaces on campus. It's right where there's a lot of traffic from students. How many people, and they bring lots of their clients in. Okay, so there's about 20 people from this community organization come, they're doing drumming, and it's very fun. How many students do you think join them? Virtually none, right? And obviously I bear some responsibility for that. The only time that I've gotten them to come is when I give bonus marks for going, right? But there's something wrong with the model that we're doing, right? You can't force people. Like, I guess back to the difference I was saying before, being caring about and caring for. Like, there we provided a technical space of inclusion or possibility of it. The large London community, we've got a couple represented here, has this incredible Monday morning music club, right? And it started super small, and it's grown big, and it's won awards, and it's very well recognized, okay? But again, it's been very inclusive of other people outside of L'Arche. So it's done a lot of heavy lifting, I think, for connecting L'Arche with the broader London community, right? You get, what would you say, Toinette, 150 to 200 people a week? 150, yeah. And sometimes I bring my students, and it's very fun. There's a lot of Elvis and Celine Dion, and so it's a lot of fun. But I think that Jim and Laurel and Toinette, some of the people who founded it, would have hoped that it would also be an inclusive space for other people in the community to come out and sing with them. Now there are a couple of other people who've come out, musicians often, but it isn't a place that other people in the community opt into. Even though lots of people love singing, lots of people would love the joy singing. We have no shortage of research about how much better we all feel when we sing, right, and bang on drums and things. But how do you make that happen? They've got this incredibly positive vibe, a great space, and yet it tends to stay separate. So is the community welcoming? There's a difference between explicit discrimination and deep attitudes. So laws and rights, I put up there, community living, laws, normalization, SRV, all of those kinds of things have definitely made changes, and we see that in the research around public attitudes, have definitely made changes in people thinking what they should say out loud, right? Talking to people who are different than them. So they don't come right out and say things out loud. But there's a difference between that and them actually changing their attitudes and having open mind and an open heart about whether they want people in the room with them. The difference between a physical presence and a sense of belonging, as we were mentioning before. Recent research is coming out, you see it every few years, but there was recently a study about the loneliness epidemic across our cities for people with disabilities living in independent living in homes in the community. So I don't point this out to say that we shouldn't have independent living or we shouldn't strive for that kind of thing. Mainstream inclusion and independent living are incredible for some people. But for other people, it can leave them vulnerable and lonely, at risk of financial and sexual abuse, right? So again, it's this idea of what is actually happening in the community, and are we pretending that something different is going to happen there? PLAN, some of you know PLAN, Planned Lifetime Advocacy Network, and parent biographies are full of these discussions about how do we create a space that would be more welcoming for our adult children with developmental disability when we're gone. How do we help create a welcoming community for them? Okay, number 2, the best friends for people with developmental disability to have are people without a developmental disability. This is a second story that echoes normalization principles and suggesting that the gold standards, of successful inclusion is when people with disabilities develop friendships with non-labeled people. The logic, though not always explicit, is probably a considerate attempt to avoid the associative effects of socializing and stigmatization. Sorry, my throat's dry. And socialization. They want to, but the effect of it is to discourage and discount the value of friendships between people with disabilities themselves, right? It's sort of making this negative valuation of disability while trying to achieve a normalization attempt. So Klotz and other researchers have said that the idea of disability as deviance is very pervasive, even among researchers with good intentions. So it's even when you're saying you want to achieve inclusion, who are you counting as part of that inclusion? Okay. And I want to go through a little bit more quickly here. So, okay, so this theme is explicit in critiques of separate education, which assert that segregating labeled and non-labeled children is tantamount to the institutional approach. Thank you. Okay, thank you. Some people say when you have, for example, in Ontario, we have 3 pilot schools. They're called pilot schools, but they've been around for 20 years. For people who make it to grade 7 or 8 and haven't achieved literacy yet. And in these schools, kids can go there for 1 to 2 years and they get thrown into a super intensive literacy programming only with other kids with learning disabilities. And they have a 95% success rate of moving kids up at least 4 grade levels in 1 to 2 years when they're with them. In many cases, those kids will move up 7 grade levels, right up to their peers. Okay? Because, as you probably know, a learning disability doesn't mean you're below average intelligence, it means you just have a learning disability. So this incredible success, but the Ontario government refuses to fund any more places in them. They only have about 100 places for all of Ontario, and they have about 8,000 kids on the waiting list. So this is one of those examples where the voice of people with disability, in that case learning disabilities, is like, I want in that school. I want to be able to read. And yet because of it's expensive, but partly our government has committed to a mainstreaming agenda. So they say, no, we don't want any more separate schools, even if they work, even if people with disabilities want them themselves. So it kind of fits into this, you have to be with non-labeled people in order for it to count as community, to count as inclusion. Okay. And this is number 3, specialization is all bad. So places like L'Arche and Special Olympics or Camp Hill come under this critique that you're seen as providing a kind of specialized or segregated form of support, care, housing, life, sports. And there seems to be this really strong narrative out there that anything that's specialized or segregated is bad, and anything that's mainstreamed or general inclusion is good. So when I talk to the students, I try to distinguish, I say, let's call them all inclusion, let's call them mainstream inclusion, specialized inclusion, and reverse inclusion, which is when you go the other way. And the reason that I do that is because I say all of those organizations have the same goal. They all want to build a sense of inclusion, community, and belonging, right? But they're doing it with different tools and different kinds of spaces. This story that most of the mainstream inclusionists tell is that there's a limited pie of money And if you put any money or leave any money in the pie of specialized and segregated programs, you will take all the pressure off the mainstream to change. You know, they want all that money to go into mainstream programming. Again, even when, as I said, there is very limited evidence that the mainstream programs are working better than the kind of things that you're doing, or generating more growth, more sense of inclusion. University of Toronto does an amazing study called Quality of Life. They do it across all kinds of groups, and it's rooted in 3 principles: being, belonging, and becoming, which sounds very similar to L'Arche, right? And in that study, they interview people with intellectual disabilities and their guardians or caregivers. And each year, those studies come out showing that people with intellectual disabilities who are employed in mainstream workplaces or have mainstream classroom placements are saying, yeah, I'm there, but nobody talks to me, nobody's friends with me, I don't get invited to things, I don't think they care if I'm here, right? So this stuff, you can go online and look at their studies, they're very well done. And this research is there, but then the conclusions at the end of the report still say, I think we should do more mainstream employment placements, right? So it seems to be this gap between what people are telling us and what we keep thinking that we should, some people think they should put programming money into. Now, I'm not saying that there couldn't ever be a day where there would be better integrated programming, mainstream programming, but I think it's a mistake to shut out all the other options ahead of time when you haven't got a better option for the people first. I put up here just the last couple of things. They often, when people criticize organizations like L'Arche or Special Olympics, and I'll give you an example of this later, they often don't propose solutions, right? They just say that you should change them or shut them down, but they don't offer something else in return. So I think one of the important things to note is that to own your own story, whatever organization you're with here today, specialization does not have to be all bad, right? Sometimes we get so busy doing the specialization work well that we don't think about how do we show that we're doing it well? How do we show that the needle has moved or that someone has felt a sense of belonging or community there? And I think that that's some work that L'Arche is starting to try to do more. Some of the people in the room here are starting to think about how do we show that? How do we, even this conference that Jen and all the people working with her have envisioned, it's saying, how do we put everyone in the room and start having those hard conversations about what people want and how we can get there? So yes, there is a negative history of segregated options and the abuses that happened in them. But just putting people in segregated settings doesn't mean that bad things will happen. I think Easter Seals is a great example of how to do that well. Easter Seals camps, a lot of people that go there have reported in research done that they've had done independently, that they feel for the first time in their life, they feel that they are not the freak. They feel like everyone's like me, so all the other things about me stand out, not just my condition or my using a wheelchair. They feel so safe in that environment because there's specialized supports that are available. So that's a great example. Special Olympics is another good example where that specialized environment means that everyone there is supportive of the learning and growth and athletic and health goals that the organization espouses and how to get there. It doesn't mean that there aren't ways the Special Olympics or Easter Seals camps could improve. Of course there are. But one of my questions is, why is it that people are saying to close them down? I was recently at a disability studies conference, and one of the people was doing a talk about eugenics, and they put up a picture of, there's a big Toronto residential support agency for people with developmental disability, which I won't say the name of, but they just built a beautiful new facility. And as everyone in here knows, there are 7 to 10 year waiting lists for any spots, right, for people with disability. And this person got up and doing their talk, they said, because this facility that was built has, I think, 40 beds in it, so it's like a form of congregate care, the title of the talk was Backwards to the Eugenic Era. And I was just like, how can you say that the shape of the building does not define the kind of care that can happen in there, right? In Vancouver, They just overhauled an entire dementia care facility. They're calling it Dementia Village, which is a bit of a weird name. But the whole priority of it is community and belonging, right? And safety, of course. But it's sort of like this recognition of this is a particular care population of people living with dementia. How are you going to provide care for them that's supportive and loving and gives them meaningful activities while also looking after some really specific care needs? And I just wanted to end on that specialization one. I said Australian school choice. In Australia, they actually have moved towards a system of allowing 3 kinds of schools. One fully integrated, what we call mainstream here. One with a blend of people being in special classrooms and mainstream classrooms. And this is for intellectual disability and learning disability. And then separate schools with all focused resources on that. And they're giving people the choice, to the extent they can, with busing and those costs. And parents are choosing all 3, and kids who want to go to those schools are choosing all 3. So it's not like people are going just to one option, and that goes back to our notion there before of the need for more choice. Okay, and the last point here is this idea that being alone but totally free to make any unfettered decisions you want is better than any form of community and compromise. So this is a story when people talk about community. When it comes to themselves, I think they recognize fully that they're part of communities, they make compromises. I know I have to eat food that my kids like, that I wouldn't necessarily like to eat all the time. I eat at different times because of their sports games, so we all make those compromises. But there's often this rhetoric that's used when it comes to people with intellectual disability, that any form of congregate or community care that would require those sort of compromises of them would be so deeply problematic versus if they were entirely free and can make decisions about when to eat and what to put on TV all the time. And what's interesting about this is that, of course, that is an attempt, again, to avoid the eugenic abuses of institutions. But what they typically do is they focus on the rules aspect of groups, the rules and the compromise, and they don't focus on all the pro-social benefits of living with other people, right? Like, what are all the good things that come from living with other people? They talk about independent living as kind of this ideal, but they don't talk about, who is it normal for? How are you going to make it happen? What are the differences between any sort of random person living independently and someone with some serious support needs? And Surrey Place in Toronto is doing a lot of interesting work about financial and sexual abuse that's happening there. But there's a real desire to oppress that information by the mainstream researchers, because it goes against the regulative ideal, right? If we acknowledge and admit that people are having real difficulties, let alone loneliness in those situations, it kind of messes up the whole rhetoric, right? Okay, so let me see the timing here. I'm gonna leave some time for questions. So just say, the issues with the stories, I think you can see, they say that they're speaking for everybody, but I think a lot of times they're speaking for people with mobility or sensory disabilities maybe who can totally live in those settings and should be able to live in those settings and choose them. Whereas I think there's a need for a continued plurality for intellectual disability. And then they're talking about an ideal of community that doesn't reflect the reality. And the last and most important one is this sort of paternalistic paradox there, that they're saying that so for example, Camp Hill and large communities have long waiting lists. In Scotland and England right now, the government is reducing funding for those communities dramatically because they're saying they're too expensive. Yes, they offer all these other things, but they're too expensive. We just want people in independent living apartments. And if they understood fully the values and wonderfulness of independent living, they would choose it. So there's sort of this assumption that disabled people, when they do speak and they do have their own voice, they're just not fully emancipated yet, right? That they're speaking out of not knowing any better. So while they're saying that they want to liberate people and make them independent, they're also treating them paternalistically. So the alternative communities, as I said, as examples, Special Olympics, Large Camp Hill, and Center for Discovery, each of them is rooted in a history of doing things differently, of prioritizing community and inclusion in different ways. And each of them offers best practices, right? None of them are perfect, but each of them offers different kinds of best practices that the mainstream could learn from. But for a variety of reasons, I think people in these communities are busy trying to make them happen and make them great. They don't always share their story outwardly, and sometimes the ways you share them don't connect necessarily with what the mainstream people are concerned about. Which is like, how do you invite people into that conversation so that once they're there, they actually want to relate to people, right? In L'Arche, for example, this happens kind of naturally. People come in there, there's storytelling, there's all this discussion and principles they use about how to value people in different ways. You know, it's not just about productivity in the traditional sense, right? It's also about listening and times of silence and loyalty and all different words that they start to learn to acknowledge or recognize, in Charles Taylor's terms, as valuable, right? Like, so I'll say to my students, when you think about who you want to go out with at night, do you always pick your smartest friend or your strongest friend? No, right? There's all kinds of reasons that make you care about someone and want to hang out with them, want to have them in your friendship group. But somehow as a society, because we culturally value those other things of productivity, intelligence, and strength, we think of those as our route to inclusion. Whereas, as you said, is to get past the homophilia, and I think, again, this is one of the genius parts of Jean, is where he was like, yeah, that's not how we should be trying to connect with each other, right? Who's the smartest, who's the best, who's the fastest, even though he could have easily competed on all those terrains. He was like, I think it's more about, who was saying vulnerability, right? It's about how I'm needy and you're needy, and I need connection, and I don't know if I'm good enough, and all those things. So that's where the homophilia could take like a different form, instead of only relating with people because they're also professors or they're also hockey players, is relating at this other level. But it does make us very vulnerable, right? So at King's, for example, I think you've probably heard a lot of universities now are doing these things, it's called Inclusion U. And so they're saying people with intellectual disabilities can go and take some courses and they get a buddy who goes around with them. And there's a lot of rhetoric that this will, quote unquote, change the culture of the university. And I don't want to diss any of those programs. I don't go to those schools, right? So maybe I should be corrected and learn. But one of the things that we're trying to do in the DS program is we're having actual classes and a whole pathway, like a series of classes, where the people with intellectual disabilities, some who are L'Arche members and some who are from the rest of the community, they're actually in the classes as students. They're non-degree students, but they're in the class as equal participants. So trying to do this idea of mutuality, right? And it's not just me, there's a team of us trying to do it, and we don't know what we're doing all the time. But we're trying to get to that homophilia that you're talking about. Like, how do you get people to relate and create an actual genuine sense of belonging, and that we need each other to get to the caring about. So that's one thing that I hope that, you know, conferences like this one today will start to push those ideas out there more of what are you doing, what have you learned about creating a genuine sense of belonging. Maybe I'll stop there. Thank you.